everyone. Welcome to our final Green Living Seminar presentation of the semester. As I think everyone knows, this semester's Green Living Seminar was organized around the theme of sustainable food and farming. And so over the course of the semester, we've heard from presenters on topics such as the New England Food Vision, organic certification, urban and indoor agriculture, challenges facing dairy farmers, and climate-smart agricultural policy. Today's presentation will last about 45 minutes with an opportunity to ask questions at the end. And we have Dorn Cox from Tuckaway Farm in New Hampshire and co-founder of Farm Hack and Farm OS, and I think a bunch of other things as well, who's going to be giving us a lecture titled Innovating Open Source Technology for Small-Scale Sustainable Agriculture. Thanks so much for coming out.
Great. So, yeah, thanks for coming out to talk about agriculture on such a gorgeous day outside. And I'm happy to talk about why I think open source technology. Are you all familiar with the idea of open source? Open source is essentially the opposite of patenting. It's essentially creating something with the intention of collaboratively developing it. And I think agriculture, fundamentally, the way that we're now understanding the agriculture's role, especially in creating a resilient climate in the face of climate change, really is a shared human endeavor. It's always been a shared human endeavor as the basis of civilization. But I think we're coming to see that in order to address climate change and be resilient to climate change, the things we need to do to adapt are the same things we need to mitigate climate change. And in that sense, it's one of the largest potential collaborative efforts or collective action that's ever that we've ever faced. And if you think about some of the other massive open source projects, you think more in terms of like the CERN Hadron Collider, or if we're thinking about deep space exploration, or the Human Genome Project, things where we all have a deep curiosity. And so I think it's a natural fit. I like to start every conversation looking at soil, because this is essentially as we're looking at how we're doing with agriculture, soil really, pardon the pun, grounds us. It's essentially our balance sheet of how we're doing biologically. Soil carbon is essentially the accumulation of photosynthesis that's extracted carbon from the atmosphere, grown into plants, fed microbes through the roots, and those microbes feeding on each other. And then essentially we're growing topsoil down. And I think that's a really important thing to start with, because we've had this conception in agriculture that essentially we degrade soil. We till it. It's the culture of the field. We often think about, the image of agriculture is the plow, which essentially is the process of degrading. And the history of civilization has largely been one of degradation of natural resources. And I think what's really changing and why it's really important for us to think about technology and the environment is to understand that we can actually reverse this process. And where historically agriculture has been, again, this process of degrading soil. In fact, the USDA, until recently, after the conservation districts were formed after the Big Dust Bowl, their big model for understanding erosion and soil management was called the Universal Revised Soil Loss Index. It was assumed that a certain amount of loss was acceptable. And so what we're now framing as we move towards this idea of soil health instead of fixed resources that we can lose is that it's something that we can grow. And that it's a biological resource, it's a regenerative resource. And so you may be hearing the idea of regenerative agriculture. But the process of understanding regenerative agriculture is really different than thinking about mechanization and chemical input-based agriculture. It's about understanding biological systems and diversity. And I'll get into a little bit about what that looks like when we apply it. But basically what we're looking at is if we can move, and I have this slide behind me. So these are actually New Hampshire soils, just a few miles from one another. Same soil type, The only difference is management. What is management? People and their understanding of what they're doing. One has improved above what would be their natural state, and one is degraded. And this degradation is on a farm that has been farmed for 200 years, and most of that degradation happened in the last 30 years. So just to give a sense, this same soil could look like that in perhaps 10 years. So this process is really important. And if we're thinking about climate change, it's really important to understand the order of magnitude. So 1% increase in that soil, if we were, and a lot of soils globally look like this, 1% increase in this soil in order the organic matter, which would just be a slight shade in a little darker color, is actually what we need to get on the path to pre-industrial levels of carbon in the atmosphere. So a small change, if 1% over 20 years. So that's not a big change, but if it were done globally, it has a massive effect. So small changes have really large effects. I'm going to show a quick film here to frame some of the technology that we're using and the collaborative process, the open source project that we're working on. Then I'll talk a little bit more about the project and what it looks like on the ground. You all see that.
So this is a pedal-powered tractor, human-powered. The amount of horsepower that is on a normal tractor is used to power the tractor itself. We grow over 100 different crops, so a very diversified farm, and one of the motivations for creating FarmOS is to be able to manage a highly diversified operation and all the complexities associated with that. I believe every farm should be a research farm, and part of what we're doing here is collecting data that can be shared globally even.
Offset. Arming.
Aerial imagery in general is a very fast, non-destructive way to collect a tremendous amount of environmental information about the farm, both for crops, but also from forest health, water health, and other systems. It allows us to elevate our perspective, quite literally. So this is just a Raspberry Pi open source, essentially a mini computer, and it's connected to a Wi-Fi connection there and a simple USB temperature probe, and it's acting as both a data logger as well as communicating and logging the temperatures it records here onto FarmOS. The hardware is in the range of maybe less than $50. And
this is
here
dated,
we
it's
have
now
the
about
page on
$5.
FarmOS that's profiling the sensor in, and here's the current value, so 32 degrees Celsius currently, which is within acceptable range. It's very important to be able to monitor the temperatures and other environmental conditions to match what the current state of our crop production is, and to manage the soil moisture levels, humidity levels, and temperature. FarmOS is a management and record-keeping system that is based essentially on creating a website that's particular to that farm. What we aim to do with FarmOS is understand a farm at its most fundamental nature, so that we can look at a survey quick on the map of which sensors are currently available. Here we can see a map of the current state of where animals are on the landscape, either individual animals or in some cases flocks or herds or groups of animals. We also have the ability to integrate other types of data into our system, like the USDA soil survey. Here's the USDA soil survey data overlaid on our own farm. The intention is to be able to have democratized access to environmental data so that anybody has access to high quality, high resolution data at very low cost and have high participation.
I think there's an extension cord over there. Okay. So if we take it from there.
Adam, you, Mike, and we could start looking at it because there's lots of options.
This is a big collaborative effort, and I think this is indicative of the idea of open collaborative science. And that's the real fun of it when we have folks from EPA and USDA and the commercial farming operation here and software developers and hardware developers all working together. So it's a lot of fun. But we're also going to be piloting a project where we're co-deploying low-cost sensors with industry standard sensors. And that's the big focus of the initiative, is to develop a protocol by which we can not eliminate the need for the industry standard sensors, but use them to validate and calibrate lower cost sensors that are more accessible to more people, to more farmers.
Let's get a little bit closer.
We've got these cheapo soil moisture monitors that also do temperature. And we're going to try to set this up next to fancier monitoring equipment that they've got out there to see how they compare. So that's the plan. Okay.
I'm going to make a spot for my temperature sensor. We'll fill that, we'll put that in, and then we're going to put the soil in there until we're at 15, so that they're just kind of in there and more stable.
Perfect.
Okay.
If you think about civilization like a tree, with agriculture at the roots and the population at the trunk and arts and commerce as the leaves and branches, and if people see themselves as part of that, where the commerce and leaves may not weather a storm, they may break and grow, but they will regrow. But if the roots of the tree are attacked, the entire system will wither and die. And that's part of this seeing oneself as part of the agrarian system. It's very important that we all have an interest in building strong roots.
I'm going to pull up my data table, and there's my data. Yeah, so that's great. So it looks like everything is working really, really well.
So we have the sensors installed in the soil. One of our objectives was to make sure that we could get end-to-end communications from the sensors in the field through to Farm OS. We've done it. Moving that data through this design will allow us to put dozens or hundreds of sensors through the same pathway. So that's very, very exciting.
I think a big part of agriculture is creating a record that's publicly accessible so future generations don't have to duplicate the work of generations past. And it's clearly in our global interest for every farmer to improve the land beneath their feet.
All right. So we get some lights. All right. Yeah. So that video was put together by GODON, which is an acronym for Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition, and it's a global effort to actually create universal access to agricultural knowledge. And interestingly, that's the direction that there's, even with the sort of the policies of the current administration, we actually had an open data, Government Data Act that was just passed that is echoing some of that here in the U.S. as well. So there's a lot of momentum, I think, at the around the idea that agriculture should be something that's pre-competitive, and that means that something that we agree that science shouldn't be something. The understanding of the way the world works and how we interact with it isn't something that we should compete on. We should collaborate on that, and then look at how we then apply that to be most productive on top of that, and in fact, enhancing our natural environment rather than degrading it. So I think that's really as the foundation, because it's very easy to get distracted in terms of the nuances of sensors and technology and so forth. But I think fundamentally what we're trying to get at with that is really how the world works, and then how do we then apply it to have our work improve the environment in a shared endeavor. So I'll talk a little bit about so my own family operation. I'm also a research director up at Wolf's Neck Center for Agriculture and the Environment, working on these sort of larger scale issues with soils and climate and collaboration in agricultural systems, and creating linkages between technologists and researchers and the general public and producers, and really trying to express how this is, again, not only is it a shared human endeavor, but it has to be collaborative, and it isn't just on the farmers to produce food. I mean, one of the things you hear is like, farmers are just 1% of the population, less than 1% of the population, and they do all this stuff. Agriculture as a concept is not so isolationist as sort of this concept of farmer. Agriculture is actually everyone. And we collectively create the agriculture that we want. Agriculture, that's the culture of the field. So I think that's a really important transition that I think we're on the edge of, and we're trying to get at, I think, with a lot of labeling and a lot of the sort of the marketing claims that agriculture is making. But so I also live and work at my own family farm in Lee, New Hampshire, and as I mentioned, about 2 miles from the University of New Hampshire, and then Wolf's Neck Center, which is a 600-acre nonprofit research and education farm in Freeport, Maine, where we're about 30,000 visitors, and we can create essentially a natural environment with all sorts of intersections between, as a test bed and a place to create those intersections. It's a really nice location where we have marine systems and freshwater systems and forestry systems and perennial systems and annual systems and grazing systems all in one location, and close to urban centers as well as rural Maine. And doing a lot of actually work linking, again, trying to cross boundaries between sort of the terrestrial systems and some of the regenerative management of aquatic systems, and working with that as well. So looking at these full cycles, because as we're looking at agriculture, our management of our environment, it's about managing nutrient flows in a lot of ways, and those don't stop at our arbitrary boundaries. They don't stop in our own bodies. They don't stop at the water's edge. And it's a really, so it's a reframing and the importance, I think, of how we think about our local agriculture and what we're trying to get out of it. So one of the things that I mentioned in the film is that we're trying to manage complexity in terms of what our agricultural systems look like. And one of the things we have at our fingertips now is these incredible, computers that can do a lot of that, handle a lot of the complexity of management, either through greenhouse monitoring or understanding the way soils work, or scheduling and calendars or plant libraries and so forth. But I like to ground that in sort of some of the agrarian history. We think about the complexity of our own operation in Lee, which I mentioned we have like 100 crops or different things that we're producing, which sounds crazy compared to some of the big monocultures. But this is just a small excerpt from an entry in the Encyclopedia of, which was a sort of a compilation, an open source, crowdsourced compilation of industrial and agricultural knowledge that was published in 1756 in France. It was actually the largest, most published book of its time, and it was meant to gather the most appropriate knowledge and disseminate it widely. So if you think about Wikipedia for agriculture in 1750 with 20,000 articles and thousands of contributors, and it's sort of the precursor to what we're trying to do with open source agriculture now, but with a printing press. And so you think about all that and how they were able to put that together, and then we look at just 1 month excerpt of what the standard good practices on a French farm at that time. Now, ignore the social system of oppression that led to the French Revolution. Just think about what was the complexity that was being managed at the time from an agricultural and a landscape perspective. Just in January, which isn't the busiest month, they're preparing hemp and flax, and they're doing their own maintenance on carts, and they're doing pollarding and coppicing, and they're developing these productive biodiverse hedgerows. They have vineyards and managing manure and compost and plowing, and look at the diversity of all the animals and products that are coming out of a single farm. And it makes you exhausted thinking about it. And it's like, are we saying now that we're not capable of managing this kind of complexity anymore? So that's a question. Are we technically advanced enough that we can't do this? Is the question. And yet we're seeing, as we're moving towards understanding what it takes to regenerate soil, and it's about increasing diversity in life, and resilience from that diversity, and that's part of what we're finding what we need to do to regenerate soil and have healthy ecosystems, is some of this. So that's what we're getting. So some of the questions I like to think about as we're sort of framing technology in agriculture is, what are the systems that we're managing? And it's a lot. And I think that's why it's also important to be collaborative, because it's very quickly overwhelming for any one individual to do this. And that French farm, in fairness, was not managed by one individual. It was a whole community. It was a feudal community, but it was a community. So what systems are we managing? And any individual farm we're managing, can you name it? We're managing animal systems, we're managing plant systems, we're managing electronics, we're managing hydraulic systems, we have to understand nutrition, we understand microbiology, animal husbandry, forest systems. It goes on and on. Basically, the level of complexity in a functioning biodiverse farm is as complex as you want to make it. It's the entire world essentially boiled down. So the point I like to make with this is that agriculture, again, is, in order to really advance, is a collaborative effort that needs everybody's input. And it's not a solitary effort to really understand it or make it better. So with all that complexity and all those different systems, what tools are you going to use to manage that? I said earlier that tools are a reflection of our understanding of that system. So a plow is essentially reflecting what we think is our understanding of how we think soil works and how we think that the plants and the seeds are going to work following that. But if we understand the plant systems better, we may choose a different approach. And then what we're finding now, for example, is that plows are actually more destructive than they are productive. But in order to get to that, we have to understand that system. So the way we get that is some of the tools are not just, and this is important too, if we think about the tools we're using in agriculture, it isn't just the things like a plow or a seed or an animal even, that you might not even think of an animal as a tool. But it's one of those things that's important. How you use it is how it turns into a tool. But other things like a microscope, is a really powerful observational tool. The telephone is an important communications tool. Text messaging, likewise, communications, relationships with universities and analytic tools. how we interpret the knowledge that we're gathering is as important as the tool, the action tool that we use in the ground. And I think that's a really important thing as we're looking at agriculture, is not just thinking about what tool can I go buy with red paint or green paint or whatnot, but understanding tools as a function of a system that you're trying to create. So I think that's a really it's an important thing to consider as we're looking at tools in agriculture. And I think the other thing that we're looking at in managing the complexity of these systems is the concept of adaptive capacity. So we've been locked in agriculture in a very narrow set of, I think, limiting the innovation in the tools that we have access to, which has dictated a very particular type of agriculture based on scale, which is created not just really rigid supply chains. So you've probably, I heard that you heard from the dairy folks and the history of dairy and sort of the movement in most of agriculture in the U.S. towards larger scale. A lot of that is through efficiencies in both the distribution system and manufacturing and value-added production. So that system is, as much as they were efficient, they were not very adaptive. And once you got stuck on those systems, they were generally very, very expensive, required a large scale and a large amount of debt. That also reduces the ability to change systems if it's no longer working. And so we have these really fragile, largely capitalized, largely debt-laden agricultural systems. And so when we're looking at tools for adaptive capacity, it's really about thinking about how do we democratize and lower the economies of scale and get some of those same efficiencies. And I would argue that we're on the edge with the recent revolution in information technology and smaller scale manufacturing that's happened in all sorts of other sectors where we have, think about the technology in your own kitchen, in your own home with washers and dryers and automatic coffee makers that have as much technology as you need for some of this value-added production, but it's not going all the way through to being able to automate your greenhouse or automate the basic, operations in the field or automate, the cost if we were manufacturing at scale of cream separators and ice cream makers and flash freezers, all that kind of stuff, it has the potential to be miniaturized. And especially where it comes to automation and sorting and things like that, a lot of that technology has really dropped just dramatically in price, where a lot of it gets down to sort of this same Moore's law where, this would be a, $150,000 device not that long ago. And I mentioned the Unix computer, full Raspberry Pi Zero is now $5. So you think about the gigabytes you have all of human history on a little microchip. So we have a greater potential that we have yet to apply. And how do we go about doing that? What does that look like? And I guess the other thing here is that's driving this is we hear a lot about the forces that have driven to this bigger, the get bigger, get out agriculture. There's this economies of scale to deliver food. And I think we're at a transition where to create systems that produce food is more about the knowledge to produce it and access to markets. And that's the ability to deliver food. So it's not, can these few people in these locations grow food for everyone, but do we have the knowledge to grow food anywhere and sell it to people who want to buy it? Can we connect that? And that's a knowledge question. That's a communications question. And and some things do require a certain level of scale. But I would say that economies of scale can be done in multiple ways. You can do it by large-scale consolidation, but you can also do it through collaboration, where you have enough people collaborating together. How do you collaborate? Well, that's a communications problem. And so it's kind of funny, again, when you talk about agriculture, you're talking about communications. But really, I think that's been one of the big challenges over the history of agrarianism has been organization, because of the physical separation of farmers from each other and from urban centers. But again, I think that's where we also have the potential, especially with the importance of agriculture in managing for climate change and improving our, now we have the issues of land management for fires, land management for flooding resilience, land management for water quality. All of those put farmers in a different category. It's not just about food production, it's about environmental services, which are opportunities to link agriculture to urban communities with a whole different set of values, and I think I would say a whole different set of future farmers attracted to that. So this is essentially the tools that we have. I mentioned action, observation, analysis, and communication. So these tools all in concert together drive farm management and decision making and the economics of the farm operation. And it's it's a different model. It's not just about it's not just the farmer and making individual economic decisions about what equipment to buy, how much debt to get, what production system, but really how does this system fit into its environment, and that analysis is being fed. So we have local action, local production with the benefit of global knowledge and a really a feedback system, both on environmental, social, and economic inputs. So as I already said this, but yeah, the tools we use are reflections. So one example I often talk about is this, where you can have a biological solution that might otherwise be approached with massive horsepower and equipment and expense. So on the right here is a daikon radish. The root tip there will push through over 300 psi, pushing through compacted layers. The equipment here is supposed to do the same thing, basically. It's pushing through and breaking up soil compaction. This does it with sunlight. This does it with diesel, ancient sunlight, and a lot of expense. There are times when this makes perfect sense, and in fact, you might use them together. But I think it's important to look at these systems and tools side by side as possible creative solutions. From an economic perspective, the energy to put this in is far less, just to plant the seed and let it go. And often the biological systems have positive other benefits, like daikon radish will also scavenge additional nutrients and nitrogen especially, and release it and create, and by storing it and then decomposing and feeding microbes. The piece of steel doesn't do that. So I guess, so it's a mix of creativity and sort of mix of scales. It's not that it's one or the other, but it's sort of thinking about how you blend those systems together and the development of those different systems, from horsepower to diesel to pedal power to communications tools. But really, it's this collaborative, adaptive, innovative process. And it's, again, as I said before, it's not a new idea. It's this diagram here is from 1918 Sears and Roebuck catalog. Not catalog, sorry, the Encyclopedia of Practical Farm Knowledge, which is kind of you have sort of an agrarian renaissance pre-petroleum phase, or sort of industrial agriculture in the U.S. 1918 there's a lot of organizing, the Grange movement, and so forth. And they were actually riffing in a lot of ways on the French physiocrats, those French land economists in the 1750s, in terms of this open source ethic of agriculture and community gathering to exchange that information and inspiration. So receiving from all ideas, information, and inspiration, and giving ideas, information, and inspiration through a community club, this adaptive cycle, this monitoring in the field of every farmer coming together, sharing observations, analyzing it, then applying the results. So what we're talking about is essentially creating a modern version of this soil information network globally based on something that has been tried and moderately successfully envisioned anyway in previous agrarian movements, but they didn't have the kinds of tools that we have today. But I really like this sort of the biological metaphor of circulation of ideas and information through the landscape, and including the community aspect. So again, not a new idea, but new in the last 30 years when we're talking about agriculture. And so I like to juxtapose this with the new tools we have, like with our map of the global internet. This is even bigger now. But this is essentially, the internet as a tool is only, 7,000 days old? So it's a relatively new tool for humanity to have access, where anybody can essentially have access to this same kind of potential for information and inspiration globally, and to be able to translate that. So to bring this back to sort of the idea of how we use that communications to scale, and alternatives to scale is sort of competitive consolidation and so forth. I mentioned collaboration and communications as a way to do that. So our own farm is part of what we call this Three Rivers Alliance, and it's essentially a co-op distribution system that delivers to over 75 restaurants in our region, and it's managed on an app so that the restaurants order from each individual farm, but we ship in a standard box. It goes out twice weekly, and it's the same from the purchaser's perspective as buying from any of the largest distributors. So they have the same sort of experience as far as what they can order. They have hundreds of products to choose from, and that level of collaboration would not be possible except for the technology. It's too complex. The relationships to manage are too complex. But this handles our billing. It handles our delivery routes. It prints our labels. All of this is very, very inexpensive at this point. So our overhead costs are 15% to deliver. So, and when you're shipping to a restaurant, you are actually selling basically at retail. So for 15% overhead, we're able to access a very large market. And what's exciting about this is also that we're now able to use that capacity to not just sell to restaurants, but we're also now selling to hospitals and schools, and to neighborhoods that are saying, oh, we can use this basically like Amazon, like Whole Foods. We can deliver what's available locally by providing access and handling that. We can also order from each other. So a lot of the dozen farms that we're working with have our own farm stores. We can use this to see what other farms have and what they're growing and communicating. What are you growing when? We carry, when we didn't have a lot of storage carrots, we ordered from a friend. We don't do some of the value-added products. We carry, one of the other farms produces salsa. We carry it in our farm store. A lot of the other farms don't do the corn tortillas that we do. So they order that from us. So it's a lot of exchange. So we're recreating a food system that doesn't require massive multinationals, but is based on this it's really simple information. And yet we can recreate essentially a food system that isn't owned and isn't beholden to a whole bunch of non-related stakeholders. So we can essentially own our own means of production, essentially based on this communication. So I think it's a really powerful concept of cooperation and tech-enabled co-op to scale, to reach economies of scale. Another example of that same concept is that working through conservation districts, we're doing a lot with shared equipment. So a lot of the equipment that we're using to improve soil health are often things you don't need every day. And they may be $30, $40, $60, $100,000 pieces of equipment. It doesn't make sense, or we couldn't justify it for a single person, but through collaboration, through our conservation districts, they are able to hold the equipment and rent it out at cost and handle the logistics. And as a third-party, trusted third party, it makes, again, that equipment available. So this is another, and then we have, not that the communications to allow for tracking who has which piece of equipment, again, is really critical to make that system work. I mentioned that, one of the products that we're doing on our farm is sort of bringing back the ornament, or bringing back some of the traditional crops. We're doing a Flint corn, which is, you might think of an ornamental corn. but it has a deep history in New England, and we developed heritage varieties and started growing them out in partnership directly with the restaurant. So we started exploring. I think, again, comes back to this theme of collaboration, where in our area, the chefs are actually a chefs collaborative, and part of that chefs collaborative is to work directly with us to develop projects. And so we're adding capacity. For example, the Flint Corn requires processing in order to turn into a value-added product, either roasted cornmeal or masa for fresh tortillas. In order to scale that up, that's not something we do entirely on our farm. We partnered with the restaurant, so we can scale through collaboration. We can reach a larger scale in adding that capacity in partnership. So I think that's another really important example, and it's something that we've seen really work well. So we went from growing for Vida Cantina, Mexican restaurant that my friend Dave Vargas started, and them making just their handmade tortillas in the one restaurant, to starting Vida Tortilla to distribute locally to about a dozen restaurants and distribute through the Three Rivers Alliance. And this product has actually has been. What's amazing about this from my perspective is that, again, because we have this direct relationship, corn is a really low margin commodity crop. But when we sell it directly to a restaurant, our effective price is, something like $5 a pound, which sounds exorbitant for corn. And yet that is less than, I think that's like 20 cents a tortilla on a $13 dish. And because of that tortilla, that restaurant is being recognized, as a James Beard, finalist. So not only because of that, but it's one of the things that is a signature piece of it. So again, taking the qualities that we're able to generate really changes the economy of food production when it doesn't have to go through this long supply chain. And we can focus on quality and connecting people. So that's again, I like to use this example because we have other really fancy fine dining places where we're supporting the local food economy, but they're, exorbitant. We're trying to, and Dave Vargas in particular is trying to create this system on dishes that anybody can afford. So a $13 meal is still affordable. So again, you'll see a theme here: participatory exploration. This process of creating these systems is collaborative, but I think part of what makes this work is not just a byproduct. I think it's inherent in it that one of the advantages of participating in creating these systems is that it's also social and it's fun. So competition has its own drivers, and that's fine, but we also have these other powerful drivers, and part of it is that collaboration and sharing and creating is really fun, and that attracts more people to it. And I think that's a key sort of driver of what makes some of these alternatives viable, is that it brings people together, and that the output, you see, in our area, all the microbreweries and the restaurant culture and so forth is really enjoyable as well. So we pull it all together, and so as was mentioned in the introduction, some of these communities require some organization, and so I've been involved in co-founding a number of these different organizations to tackle different pieces of it. Farm Hack is one that really focuses on the hardware and sort of young farmer diversified operations to trying to have a catalog of open source technology. The Gathering for Open Ag Tech is really focused on some of the more sensor-based stuff and software and so forth. But the Gathering for Open Ag Tech recently also created intersections with agriculture of all scales as well, and we began cataloging all these different communities and the software tools, and we represented in our first gathering of about only 50 participants, we cataloged over 70 tools that included crop planning and monitoring and operations automation and hardware projects. So as we start to find each other, there's a lot of power and that we're discovering that we didn't realize that we had. I'd mentioned earlier that sort of agriculture as this shared human endeavor is really important, and sort of the types of technology that we're using was really important in that it's not just plows and harrows and tractors and combines. That I think one of the key things that we're looking for agriculture to right now is really this idea of an observatory and a different kind of, so we're looking to our landscapes for these other functions from a biological perspective, from managing climate change and so forth. And I think the general public is seeing a general interest in how food is produced. And so I think the idea of farms as observatories, as sort of windows into how we're interacting with our land, how we're managing our landscape, is really important. And so the observatory, I think, is really important as sort of partly in contrast to sort of a laboratory, which you think is sort of this closed, exclusive science approach to inquiry. This observatory, I think, has this place in our culture of sort of a public science, a science that we all have a place in improving and understanding. We all have an interest in how our management of the landscape works. And so I think part of what we're doing right now is creating the foundation for creating farm observatories and democratizing access to that knowledge by using the tools that we have that are low cost and that we develop together to make that possible. So I mentioned, Farm OS is one example of that. So it's a tool a free and open source tool that any farm can download. It can be hosted at very low cost, and it allows for documenting any farm operation of any scale, from a smallholder in Malawi to large-scale row crop in the upper Midwest to grazing operations in the Southeast. They all can be documented and shared. It's a platform essentially for that collaboration. And I think really important is that from its outset, it's been designed with the farmer in mind rather than creating a proprietary business. So it's not designed around a business model. It's designed around democratizing access and sharing, and the business model is essentially created through collaboration. So that's, and first, and some of those things and I think that's important, especially in this age of things like Facebook and privacy. By building it that way from the ground up, we can build trust, and we can create truly systems where we're opting in and deciding how much we want to share and with whom, and really shift who's in control as we look at how we're engaging with technology, especially communications and information technology and social media, because really we're sort of on the edge as we start to collaborate across farms. We're creating different social media essentially. So, and I think I just got a couple more minutes here. So yeah, other examples of really important open source hardware that's in the middle of development right now and is the Quick Carbon project that my friend Greg Ostick has been developing the technology for. So the upper left-hand corner is a prototype of an open source handheld spectrometer. So one of the things that I like to mention here is, again, every object has politics behind it, is political, I should say. And so historically, spectrometers have been some of those things where it's maybe $60,000 to buy a spectrometer. Well, that means that there are only a certain number of places and a certain number of people that actually have access to that, and yet it's a really powerful tool. So one of the things that, that's the mission of the RSci community, that's also part of the other open source tech folks, is to lower the cost, because the actual chips are now really inexpensive. So he's essentially developed, or his community has developed a handheld spectrometer that will be less than $300, and it will probably come down from there. So that's the prototype cost. So $60,000, $50,000, $20,000 to hundreds, and I think that will again come down. You can buy an Android phone for $30 now. So there's and what that enables us to do is a process of being able to, instead of sending a soil sample to a lab to get a carbon sample, you can get it instantly in the field. So that means instead of hundreds and thousands of dollars to sample a field, you can do thousands of samples in a day and get instant results and interpret them yourself. So totally different relationship to environmental understanding of your own backyard. There's another campaign that's using the same tool to analyze nutrient density in foods. So looking at the leaf tissue analysis so you can understand sort of what you're buying, how much of it is water and how much of it is actually nutrients, and start to... But in order for this to work, it requires a great deal of collaboration, not just in the development of the tool, but in order for tools like this to work, you actually have to have access to a huge amount of data that everybody else is helping to contribute to make some meaning out of its analysis. So it's a really powerful tool and really exciting, and also another example of the importance of that collaboration. So I'll just end on this because I like to frame sort of our task here from agriculture's perspective is, we have this potential, over, millions of years of evolution has produced seeds and breeds and animals and plants that are designed to grow everywhere on Earth. In millions of years of that evolution, and we now have the power to analyze it and decide what we want to do with it, how we communicate that with these new tools that are only thousands of days old, so millions of years, thousands of days old, and what do we want to do with it? How do we want to use that to transform our agriculture from an extractive enterprise to something that's regenerative? And we can grow, as my friend Abe Collins says, a deep topsoil future. So I'll end with that. And we can have some questions.
We do have a few minutes for questions. Are there questions? So I'll throw out maybe a quick question and then maybe a slightly longer one. So I think in the video it said at Wolf's Neck Center you were looking at comparing the low-cost sensors to the higher-tech one. So have the results come in from that yet, or is that still in process?
Yeah, so what we're finding is that some of the it's across the board. Some of the low-cost sensors are just not very good, and some of them are just fine but need to be calibrated, and often the difference is not in the sensor itself, it's in the housing. It's making it weatherproof. And so then it's not a matter of sort of the manufacturer of the sensor, it's really how is it appropriately deployed. So the technology is actually in the enclosure, or putting it, embedding it in epoxy, or better wires going to it. So the failure usually, I can't summarize, but has often been not in the sensor itself. But certainly the communications technology is getting lower cost and much more reliable. We have a little sensor board that Don Blair, who's actually in that film, again, that was a couple years ago. But we have one deployed that's been working nonstop for the last year. And all sorts of other stuff. The big, the commercial Campbell Scientific stuff has been up and down, and that thing just keeps plugging away. So it's been, so there are really bright spots in that.
I'll hold off to see if there's another.
Yep.
When will those handheld spectrometers be available?
They're available now. Yeah. You can't order it on Amazon, but if you go, because they're still prototypes, you have to order them in the manufacturing batches. But and that's one of the big challenges with the open source hardware is developing sort of the scalable sort of manufacturing model for that. And that's been one of the big and manufacturing hardware is one of those challenging things. But it is available. So if you and the folks who have been promoting it a lot are the Real Food Campaign. So I think it's realfoodcampaign.org. I think they had a way where you could order them through that. Where you go directly to rsci. I'm going to get the web address wrong, or the Yale Quick Carbon Project. In Massachusetts, NOFA is actually doing on-farm field trials with that on nutrient density starting this year. They got a National Conservation Innovation Grant Award from USDA and they're using both the RSI spectrometer as well as PharmOS for logging their information, and it's the same platform that they're using in Pennsylvania on a similar project, and it's the same platform that we're using in the Pacific Northwest and in Colorado and in Malawi. So it's really, there's some really neat cross-pollination happening. But those projects have gotten the first round of them, but you can definitely, I'm still waiting for mine too, so. But definitely, but they are available if you wait for the next production round.
How much does it cost now?
$300.
So I think what we'll do is I am always aware of needing to get the students to dinner before the cafeteria closes. But I think our speaker will stick around for a few minutes if there's folks who want to come up and ask questions. And so another thank you to Dorn, and thank you for all of your participation this semester and attending these lectures and all of the good questions. It's been a real pleasure to have done this. So thanks to everybody.